Speaking, though, Krystal, of just throwing Congress into chaos and disarray, everything isn't quite neat and unified on the Democratic side either at the moment. What's happening on the left side of the chamber?
Yeah, so, you've had some, and this is unusual in American history, you have had some voices of dissent from the idea that we will back Israel no matter what. Now, in my opinion, no country should be given a no matter what blank check. But in particular, Israel, given their record, I mean, even just looking at how they're prosecuting this current war and, committing what the UN is describing as violations of international law or war crimes, specifically with the complete siege. And so even before this latest hospital airstrike, which has obviously upped the emotional level just an infinite amount, you had a little bit of dissenting voices, and you had a huge crackdown from the White House describing, just calls for like a ceasefire as repugnant. But now with the civilians killed at this hospital, the emotions are so much higher. And so the tenor of the discussion between this, handful of more left members of Congress, the tenor of the discussion between them and Joe Biden has significantly changed. Let's go ahead and put Rashida Tlaib's comments here up on the screen. Rashida Tlaib, Palestinian American, who's been one of the, leading voices in terms of a different approach on Israel. She says Israel just bombed the Baptist hospital, killing 500 Palestinians, doctors, children, patients, just like that. POTUS, this is what happens when you refuse to facilitate a ceasefire and help de-escalate. Your war and destruction-only approach has opened my eyes. And many Palestinian Americans and Muslim Americans like me, we will remember where you stood. You had Ilhan Omar also tweeting, let's put this up on the screen, bombing a hospital is among the gravest of war crimes. The IDF reportedly blowing up one of the few places the injured and wounded can seek medical treatment and shelter during a war is horrific. POTUS needs to push for an immediate ceasefire to end this slaughter. This comes on the heels, let's put this up on the screen, from Ryan's outlet from The Intercept. On Monday, before the hospital bombing, you had 13 Democrats in the House, led by Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Andre Carson, Summer Lee, and Delia Ramirez, introduce a resolution urging the Biden administration to call for an immediate de-escalation and ceasefire in Israel and occupied Palestine and to send humanitarian aid to Gaza. And you also did have Bernie Sanders seeming yesterday to call for a ceasefire, saying these unspeakable crimes must stop now. The bombs and missiles from both sides must end. Massive humanitarian aid must be rushed to Gaza, and the hostages must be returned to their families. So, I think this marks a dramatic shift, even though this is just a few voices in the Democratic caucus, in where the Democratic Party has usually been. I mean, support like unequivocal, unconditional support for Israel has long been a bedrock of bipartisan policy between Republicans and Democrats. You've had huge money efforts that Ryan has covered very closely to try to make sure and force discipline on that question of we will always stand with Israel no matter what they do, no matter what comes, with huge amounts of American dollars in aid. There has been big money efforts to make sure that any candidates who might deviate from that narrative, including Summer Lee, by the way, who's on this resolution, that they get crushed in primaries, that they're defeated at the ballot box. And still, because you have a much different view of this conflict between Israel and Palestine among young Democrats in particular, a majority of whom sympathize in general outside of this current conflict with Palestinians, you have some of that starting to creep in. And I mean, Emily, I'll tell you from my personal perspective, I will never forget the fact that just calls for a ceasefire from the White House, Karine Jean-Pierre called those calls repugnant and shameful. And now we see, whoever side of the story you believe with regard to the hospital, now we see just the horrors of continuing this bombing campaign with no end in sight, the human toll here. And you called a ceasefire, calls for a ceasefire and diplomacy, you call them repugnant. You banned State Department officials, according to a memo that Huffington Post reported on, from talking about a ceasefire, for calling to an end to bloodshed, calling to restore calm. Our diplomats were banned from even using those words. That is something that I will never forget, and clearly has been seared into the consciousness of a few of these dissident members of Congress.
This is a really interesting block to do after our last conversation in the previous block about how Republicans are, in disarray at the moment, and in the Beltway, and I think rightfully to some degree that's treated as kind of an embarrassment, and the sort of right flank, the House Freedom Caucus guys are being blamed for the chaos, when, in reality, I think a lot of that blame goes to the establishment, which is utterly unmoving in some cases and unwilling to work with people, although that wasn't true of Kevin McCarthy. And Krystal, I've had this conversation with Ryan a few times. I'm curious what you think, too, about the squad sort of taking a page out of the Freedom Caucus book and really starting to push the party's leadership and the House side a lot harder. Is this something you think that could, especially because it's unfolding in the context of the speakership battle with their Republican colleagues, is this something you think could trigger maybe a more permanent or a more serious, now that Nancy Pelosi is out, this is one of the big dividing lines post-Pelosi with Hakeem Jeffries, a more serious divorce between leadership and squad members?
I doubt it. If I'm being real. Just because, the Hakeem Jeffries point is an interesting one, because Nancy Pelosi is very effective at enforcing loyalty, and massive fundraiser, able to deliver dollars to struggling campaigns, clearly was very effective at getting the AOCs of the world in line with her agenda and buying into, you'll get more with, what do they say? More with honey than vinegar. Right. Yeah, exactly. She clearly got them to buy into that. And so from AOC originally protesting outside of her office to then admitting that she had changed her governing philosophy and she was working more the inside game, that was very effective. Will Hakeem Jeffries be as effective in enforcing that kind of loyalty and discipline? Hard to say. But I really think the big enforcer of loyalty and discipline is Donald Trump. Because when it comes down to it, and I also don't want Trump reelected. So I'm actually sympathetic to this view of if you are, if you dissent, if you're criticizing Joe Biden from the left, if you're, making a big fuss about whatever, you're just providing succor to the Republicans. You're helping to reelect Donald Trump, and he's a million times worse than Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm skeptical that as long as Donald Trump is hanging out there over everyone's heads, that the fundamental dynamics of the political situation in the Democratic Party are going to change. And we saw this. I don't know if you got a chance to watch the results of the focus group that we did with Democratic-based voters down around Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And when they were talking about Joe Biden, they're like, oh, we like it. They have affection for him. They're concerned about his age. They don't see him as super competent. Somebody used the term frail. He seems soft. He's not, if you're watching the videos of him in Israel, it's not an impressive sight in terms of his verbal articulation or forcefulness. But ultimately, they're like, yeah, of course we're going to vote for him. And we don't even really want him to be challenged in the primary because, we might like other options. What we really want is him to step aside because we're worried that a messy democratic process may, help enable Donald Trump back into the White House. Now, I understand why they believe that. I think that is bullshit that, the media has persuaded them of, because we've seen very vitriolic primaries on the Republican side in 2016, on the Democratic side between Hillary and Obama, and those candidates came out better and ended up winning the White House. So I don't think that is accurate. But Donald Trump is shaping the views of Democratic-based voters and is very much shaping the views of Democrats in Congress as well. So while you see in this particular moment, and especially with Ilhan and with Rashida Tlaib, who still has family in, that she's not allowed to visit, by the way, in the occupied territories. It's very visceral. It's very emotional. They're sort of breaking that layer of decorum that is typically under their laying over their even veiled criticisms of the administration. But I don't think that will last. I don't think it will lead to a real shift towards sort of Freedom Caucus tactics, because the fundamental dynamics remain the same, that Donald Trump is the biggest threat, and ultimately they'll do what they need to do to be loyal Democratic soldiers to try to make sure that he doesn't ascend to the White House again.
This is actually so interesting, because my understanding has always been that Nancy Pelosi was the wrangler and was just very, very good at persuading people like AOC to the point that you mentioned. And I actually wonder how much Nancy Pelosi is still helping Hakeem Jeffries sort of make that argument and make that pitch in the lower chamber, because that's sort of been baked into their identity now, thanks to Pelosi. Like, they look at what the Republicans are doing, and even people in the squad, who, by the way, the disagreement between Rashida Tlaib and the Josh Gottheimer types of people, when they're Richie Torres, like that, they can have disagreements over Medicare for all, et cetera, et cetera. This disagreement over calls for a ceasefire and over questions as it pertains to Israel and Palestine has already gotten really ugly, and for understandable reasons, and it's so deep and personal that, for them to maintain unity in the face of that deep personal disagreement is, that's a feat for Democratic leadership. That's, in some ways a testament to how well they've sold the squad this argument that if you sort of stay coalesced and in line, you will get more wins down the road. I think that's a reasonable argument, although I don't think it is the most reasonable argument. I don't think it's the winning argument. I actually think the Freedom Caucus has proved that. Congress isn't really doing anything anyway. They've punted almost all of their duties to the executive branch, and actually representing the voters who sent you to Congress, whether you're in the Bronx or you're in, rural Tennessee, is what you're there to do. And, if anything, the Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi's are standing in the way of that in the interest of serving San Francisco and, other places. So it is kind of fascinating. Those dynamics are, but we'll have to see how it turns out this time. I think you're right. I would put my money where you're putting your money.
Well, think this last comment on this, think of even just this issue. So even if, you are very sympathetic, not to Hamas, but to Palestinians and their, righteous fight for self-determination, and that's where your predominant sympathies lie. Well, if your choice is between Trump and Biden, even on this issue, even as abhorrent as I found, the idea of a ceasefire being shot down as repugnant, even as abhorrent as I find that, there's no doubt that you'd rather have Biden on this issue if you are in favor of Palestinian statehood and Palestinian human rights. Trump gave Netanyahu everything he wanted. Now, it's fair to say also Biden didn't really roll any of that back, but he hasn't actively gone and exacerbated the situation, just like greenlit settlements. There is at least some talk of caring about the human beings in Palestine, even if it is, much further down the priority list than backing up Israel. So even on this one issue, if you put it to Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, okay, well, here are your two choices. Here would you pick? There's no doubt who they'd be on the side of. So that's why I think that it doesn't fundamentally shift the dynamics, even as emotions are understandably incredibly, incredibly high and raw and fraught right at the moment.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.